What happens when a man who has everything tries to humiliate a woman who has nothing? Julian Sterling, a billionaire titan of industry, thought it would be a funny party trick. He held up an ancient, untranslatable artifact, and with a sneer, looked at his black maid, Clara. He declared in front of his wealthy friends, "Translate this, and my entire year's salary is yours." He expected silence. He expected shame. What he got was a lesson that would shatter his world, unravel his empire, and prove that true wealth has nothing to do with money. This isn't just a story. It's the account of how a single quiet woman's voice brought a titan to his knees. The air in Julian Sterling's penthouse apartment was different. It wasn't just the altitude 48 stories above Central Park that made it thin. It was the pressure. It was a carefully curated atmosphere of success so potent and suffocating it felt like a physical weight on the chest. For Clara Bellwether, that weight was the price of her employment. 5 days a week, Clara entered this world a ghost in a simple black and white uniform. She moved through rooms adorned with Jean-Michel Basquiat originals and furniture that cost more than her parents' home, her presence as unnoticed as the climate control system that kept the Italian marble floors at a perfect 22 degrees Celsius. She was 42 years old, but in the Sterling household, her age, like her past, was irrelevant. She was simply the help. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when Clara's world was one of Dusty Library's academic debates, and the thrill of deciphering the lost words of ancient civilizations. Dr. Bellwether she had been, a tenured professor of historical linguistics at Brown University, specializing in Semitic and Cushitic languages. She had published papers mentored graduate students and held a passion for language that was all-consuming. But life, in its cruel and unpredictable fashion, had ripped that world away. A brutal car accident had claimed her husband, leaving her with a mountain of medical debt, and a grief so profound it stole her focus, her drive, and ultimately her career. Academia, she learned, had little patience for prolonged sorrow, so she had fallen from the ivory tower to the service elevator of a Manhattan high-rise. Julian Sterling was a man carved from the very archetype of new money. His fortune, amassed through a series of ruthless tech acquisitions under his company, Ethelred Acquisitions, was ostentatious and loud. He wore his success like armor, and he wielded his power like a weapon. He wasn't just wealthy. He was contemptuous of anyone who wasn't. He treated his staff with a casual disdain that was somehow more wounding than outright cruelty. He would drop his cashmere coat on the floor inches from Clara's hand without a word, spill wine on a freshly polished surface, and walk away or issue commands into the air, expecting them to be fulfilled by the invisible forces that kept his life pristine. His wife, Eleanor Sterling, was a different study in misery. She was beautiful, elegant, and trapped. Dressed in Chanel and draped in diamonds, she moved through her gilded cage with a quiet resignation. She was never unkind to Clara, but she was never truly kind either. Her interactions were marked by a polite, fearful distance, as if showing any genuine warmth to a member of the staff would be a betrayal of her husband's unwritten rules. Sometimes Clara would catch Eleanor staring out the vast floor-to-ceiling windows, her expression not one of admiration for the sprawling city below, but of a prisoner gazing at a world she could no longer touch. Clara understood that look. She felt it too. Tonight was different. Tonight was one of the Sterlings' infamous dinner parties. These were not gatherings of friends. They were strategic alignments of power. Tech moguls, hedge fund managers, art collectors, and the occasional senator would assemble in the penthouse's grand salon. For the staff, it was a grueling, high-stakes performance. Every glass had to be full, every canapé perfectly presented, every potential need anticipated and met before it was voiced. Clara was in the kitchen, arranging microgreens on a tray of seared scallops when Julian Sterling stormed in. He wasn't looking at her, but at his phone, his face a mask of fury. Useless. Absolutely useless. He snarled, not to anyone in particular. I pay the curator at the Met a consulting fee that could fund a small country, and he can't find anyone. It's too obscure, Julian. The dialect is Proto-Aksumite with possible Sabaean influences. Excuses. He slammed his phone down on the stainless steel counter, making the sous chef flinch. Clara remained still, her hand steady over the scallops. She knew what he was talking about. It was his latest obsession, a small dark stone tablet he'd acquired at a highly questionable auction of antiquities. It was covered in a script that had so far baffled every expert he'd thrown money at. For Julian, it wasn't about historical value. It was about conquest. He wanted to own something no one else could understand, to solve a puzzle that had stumped the world's greatest minds. He finally seemed to notice Clara. A smirk played on his lips. What do you think, Clara? You think you could figure it out? Maybe it's some ancient recipe for cleaning fluid. Clara didn't rise to the bait. She kept her eyes down, her expression neutral. The scallops are ready for the first course, sir, she said, her voice soft and even. His smirk widened. He enjoyed her impassivity. He interpreted it as subservience, a confirmation of his own superiority. Of course they are, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. He picked up his phone and walked out, leaving a chill in the warm, busy kitchen. Later, as the guests began to arrive, Clara moved through the salon, a silent observer of a world she once brushed shoulders with, albeit in a different context. She recognized a face here and there. Dr. Alistair Finch, a renowned historian from Columbia, a man whose work she had once cited in her own papers. He was deep in conversation with a senator, oblivious to the woman in the maid's uniform, refilling his water glass. The irony was a familiar, bitter taste in her mouth. The evening wore on a symphony of clinking glasses, forced laughter, and the low hum of self-congratulation. Julian was in his element, holding court, his voice booming over the others. Clara worked tirelessly, her movements efficient and invisible, her mind 1,000 miles away in the dusty archives of a forgotten time. She was so focused on her tasks, clearing plates, refilling wine, avoiding eye contact, that she didn't notice the moment Julian's attention and the attention of the entire room shifted directly to her. The weight in the air was about to become unbearable. The main course had been served a filet mignon that had been flown in from a specific pedigreed herd in Japan, and the wine, a 1982 Chateau Margaux, was flowing freely. Julian Sterling, buoyed by the alcohol and the fawning attention of his guests, was at the peak of his performance. He loved the theatrics of these evenings, the slow build to a moment where he could unveil a new painting, a new acquisition, a new symbol of his dominance. Tonight, the centerpiece was the stone tablet. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice silencing the chatter. He gestured towards the center of the grand marble fireplace mantel, where the object sat on a velvet cushion illuminated by a single dramatic spotlight. "Some of you collect art, some of you collect companies. I, however, have recently taken to collecting the impossible." A ripple of intrigued murmurs went through the room. The guests, titans of their own industries, leaned forward. They understood the language of conquest. The tablet was small, no larger than a modern paperback book, and made of a dark, obsidian-like stone. Its surface was covered in finely etched characters, a script that resembled no known modern language. The letters were angular and elegant, flowing in a way that suggested immense history and a forgotten artistry. This, Julian continued walking over to the mantel and picking it up with a proprietary air, is from the pre-Aksumite empire of Demt, what is now modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea. We're talking nearly 3,000 years old. Older than the Parthenon. Older than Rome. He held it up for all to see. Dr. Alistair Finch, the historian from Columbia, squinted, his academic curiosity piqued. "Julian, that's extraordinary," Finch said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "The script appears to be a variant of Old South Arabian, but those ligatures, they're unusual, possibly gaze. Where on earth did you acquire it?" Julian beamed, pleased to have impressed the one man in the room who could truly appreciate the artifact's rarity. "Let's just say I have friends in low places with access to high history," he said with a wink, a line that was clearly rehearsed. "But here's the rub. I've had it looked at by the best. The British Museum, the Louvre, specialists from Tel Aviv to Addis Ababa. They can all tell me what it is, but none of them can tell me what it says." He paced in front of the fireplace, relishing the role of the great patron stumped by ancient mysteries. They say the dialect is extinct, a linguistic dead end. A few of the characters are recognizable, but the syntax, the grammar, it's a ghost, a whisper from a lost world that no one can hear. He paused for dramatic effect, letting the weight of his statement settle over the opulent room. His guests looked at the tablet with a new respect. It was no longer just an old rock. It was a symbol of unconquerable knowledge, a final frontier that even Julian Sterling's immense wealth could not breach. And that's when he saw her. Clara Bellwether was moving silently along the edge of the room, collecting empty dessert plates. Her movements were economical, graceful, and utterly unobtrusive. She kept her gaze fixed on her task, her face a carefully composed mask of professional neutrality. In that moment, to Julian, she was the embodiment of the service class, silent, invisible, and, in his mind, simple. An idea cruel and brilliant in its simplicity sparked in his wine-addled brain. It was a perfect opportunity to underscore his point, to create a memorable moment of theatre, and to indulge his favorite pastime, casual humiliation. It would be a story he could tell for years. He held up his hand to stop her. "Clara, hold a moment." Clara froze. The command was sharp, unexpected. She stood by the credenza, a stack of delicate porcelain plates in her hands. Every head in the room turned towards her. The sudden spotlight was blinding, a violation of the unspoken rule of her invisibility. Her heart began to pound against her ribs. "Come here," Julian commanded, beckoning her with a flick of his fingers. Hesitantly, she set the plates down and walked towards the fireplace. The Persian rug felt like a mile of hot coals. She could feel 20 pairs of eyes on her, curious, amused, pitying. She kept her own eyes fixed on a point on the floor, just in front of Mr. Sterling's expensive Italian shoes. Eleanor Sterling shifted uncomfortably in her chair, a flicker of alarm in her eyes. "Julian, what are you doing?" she murmured, but he ignored her. He held the stone tablet out towards Clara, a wide, predatory grin spreading across his face. The room was utterly silent, thick with anticipation. "Clara," he said, his voice loud and performative. "We have a mystery here, a puzzle that has stumped the world's most brilliant minds. Men with more degrees than a thermometer. They look at this and see nothing but scribbles." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, mocking tone. "But you're always so quiet, aren't you? Always watching. You must be thinking deep thoughts as you dust my Fabergé eggs." A few of his sycophantic guests chuckled. Clara's knuckles were white at her sides. She felt a familiar hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Julian's grin became a triumphant sneer. He was ready for his grand finale, the challenge that would cement his legend for the evening. The air in the salon crackled with a strange, uncomfortable energy. The guests, a mix of the powerful and the privileged, watched the bizarre spectacle unfold. It was like a scene from a decadent historical play, the lord of the manor publicly toying with the scullery maid. Some shifted in their seats, a flicker of conscience warring with their desire not to offend their host. Others, fueled by wine and a shared sense of superiority, watched with undisguised amusement. Julian Sterling savoured the moment. All eyes were on him and his chosen prop. He held the stone tablet inches from Clara's face, the ancient script, a meaningless pattern to his eyes, but a powerful symbol of his intellectual reach. "You see these little chicken scratches, Clara?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is what has the so-called experts shaking in their tweed jackets. A lost language, a forgotten people." He circled her slowly like a shark. Clara remained ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on the floor. She could feel the heat radiating from the fireplace behind her, and the much more intense heat of humiliation on her face. Her mind was a whirlwind. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floorboards, to be anywhere but here, the focal point of this cruel game. Then Julian stopped directly in front of her, his face inches from hers. The smell of expensive wine and self-satisfaction was overpowering. He raised the tablet one last time and delivered his masterstroke, the line he had been building towards. "I'll tell you what," he boomed, projecting to every corner of the room. "I'm feeling generous tonight, a true patron of the arts and sciences." He paused, ensuring he had everyone's rapt attention. "Clara, you think you're clever? You want to impress us all?" He swept his arm around the room, indicating the assembly of millionaires and billionaires. "Go on. Translate this." A nervous titter went through the crowd. The proposition was absurd. It was like asking a cat to do calculus. Julian leaned in his voice, a low, taunting whisper that was still audible to the nearest guests. "Translate this little rock for me, right here, right now, and my entire year's salary is yours." The room gasped. It was no longer just a joke. It was a wager of staggering proportions. Julian Sterling's salary from Ethelred acquisitions, not including bonuses and stock options which were astronomical, was a matter of public record, a cool $12 million. A life-changing, world-altering sum of money. He had thrown down the gauntlet, so utterly confident in its impossibility that the offer was to him meaningless. It was pure theatre. He expected her to stammer, to look down in shame, to shrink away, thereby proving his point about the natural order of things. He would then laugh, pat her on the shoulder, and perhaps magnanimously tell her to fetch another bottle of wine, her humiliation complete. Eleanor shot up from her seat. "Julian, that's enough. This is cruel." "Sit down, Eleanor," he snapped, not even glancing at her. "We're having a bit of fun." All eyes were on Clara. The silence stretched thick and heavy. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her mind, however, was no longer a whirlwind of shame. Something had shifted. As he'd held the tablet close, her eyes, trained by decades of study, had instinctively focused on the script. The chicken scratches weren't just scratches. They were letters. They were words. And they were familiar. It was like seeing the face of a long-lost friend in a crowd. The initial shock, the disbelief, then the flood of recognition. It wasn't just Ge'ez, the classical liturgical language of Ethiopia she knew so well. It was an older, transitional form. The Proto-Aksumite script Dr. Finch had mentioned, with its distinct Sabaean characteristics, the very specific dialect she had written her doctoral dissertation on. The one subject on Earth she knew better than anyone alive. A lifetime of being overlooked, of being underestimated, of swallowing her pride, of grieving her lost world, coalesced into a single crystalline moment of clarity. The humiliation he intended for her was a fire, but instead of burning her, it forged something within her into steel. She lifted her head. For the first time that evening, she looked directly into Julian Sterling's eyes. Her own gaze was clear, steady, and devoid of fear. The sudden change in her demeanor was so stark, it made him take an involuntary step back. The meek maid was gone. In her place stood someone else, entirely. "Your salary," Clara said, her voice quiet, but carrying an astonishing resonance in the silent room. "For the entire year." Julian was taken aback by her response. He had expected mumbled apologies, not a negotiation. "Yes," he scoffed, recovering his bravado. $12 million. Before taxes, of course. Not that you'll have to worry about that. Clara held his gaze. "You have a verbal contract," she stated, not asked. "In front of witnesses." She glanced briefly at Dr. Finch, who was now leaning forward, his mouth slightly agape, then around the room at the other guests. A flicker of unease crossed Julian's face. This was not going according to his script. "It's a figure of speech, you ridiculous woman," he snarled. "Now are you going to try, or are you going to waste more of my time?" Clara took a slow, deliberate breath. She let the silence hang for another second, making him wait. Then she extended a single, steady hand. "May I see it, please?" A collective intake of breath swept through the salon. Julian Sterling stared at Clara's outstretched hand as if it were a serpent. Her audacity was stunning. For a moment, he seemed poised to refuse to call the whole thing off and have her thrown out. But he was trapped. Every person in the room had heard his challenge. To back down now would be an admission of cowardice, a greater humiliation than any she could inflict on him. His face contorted into a mask of bitter amusement. "By all means," he sneered, thrusting the heavy stone tablet into her hand with more force than necessary. "The stage is yours." Clara accepted the tablet. The moment her fingers touched the cool, smooth stone, a jolt went through her, a current of connection that spanned 3 millennia. The weight of it was familiar grounding. The world around her, the opulent room, the gawking faces, the arrogant billionaire seemed to fade into a muted background. All that existed was her and the stone. She held it up to the light from the fireplace, her dark eyes scanning the inscription, not with the frantic guesswork of a novice, but with the calm, methodical precision of a master. Her lips moved silently for a second, reacquainting herself with the ancient flow of the language. The guests leaned in their mockery, turning to rapt curiosity. This was no longer a joke. Something was happening. Dr. Alistair Finch was on the edge of his seat, his historian's mind racing. He recognized the look on Clara's face. It was the look of pure, unadulterated academic focus, a state of concentration he had seen in the world's leading cryptographers and linguists. But to see it in the Sterling's maid, it was impossible. After a full minute of silent study, Clara looked up, not at Julian, but at the assembled guests. She was no longer Clara the maid. She was Dr. Bellwether the professor, about to deliver a lecture. "This isn't just gaze," she began, her voice clear and academic, utterly transformed from its earlier subservience. "It's a transitional script from roughly the 8th century BCE. The confusion for modern scholars arises from the fact that it borrows several graphemes from Sabaean, the language of the kingdom of Saba, across the Red Sea, but it applies them using Cushitic grammatical structures. It's an incredibly rare find. Most inscriptions from this period are dedications to the god Al-Muka, but this one is different." She paused, letting the technical details settle. Dr. Finch's eyes widened in stunned recognition. She wasn't just guessing. She was providing a doctoral-level analysis. The inscription is a proverb. Clara continued her gaze, now sweeping the room, before finally landing like a judgment on Julian Sterling. It is written in the first person, as a piece of wisdom passed from a father to a son. She took a deep breath, and then she began to translate. Her voice was steady, imbued with a strange melodic cadence that seemed to echo the ancient words themselves. My son, they will tell you to build your house from the heaviest stones, to fill your coffers with the gleam of gold and the shine of silver. They will tell you that power is a shield, and that the roar of your name should echo from the mountains. She traced a line of the script with her finger. They will tell you that the measure of a man is in the height of his walls and the breadth of his lands. But I have seen empires turn to dust, and the rivers of time wash away the strongest stone. A profound, unnerving silence had fallen over the room. The only sound was Clara's voice and the crackle of the fire. The guests were frozen, their wine glasses forgotten in their hands. Julian Sterling's sneer had vanished, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed disbelief. The words she was speaking seemed aimed directly at him, a ghostly arrow shot across 3,000 years. Clara's voice grew stronger, more resonant. Listen to my final truth. The measure of a man is not in the gold he gathers, but in the grace he shows to those he deems beneath him. She let that line hang in the air, a perfect, shimmering indictment. For a kingdom built on fear will be consumed by it, and a house built on arrogance will stand on a foundation of sand. But a man who lifts up the lowly, who gives voice to the silent, his legacy will be carved not in stone, but in the hearts of generations. That is the only true kingdom. That is the only wealth that endures. She finished. The final word echoed and then vanished, leaving a silence so complete, so absolute, that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a hammer blow. Clara gently placed the tablet back on its velvet cushion on the mantelpiece. She smoothed her simple uniform and stood tall, her eyes still locked on Julian Sterling. He was ashen. The proverb hadn't just been translated. It had been used as a weapon against him in his own home, in front of his most important associates. He had been stripped bare, his arrogance and cruelty exposed and condemned by a voice from the ancient past, channeled through the one person in the room he considered less than human. The spell was finally broken by Dr. Alistair Finch. He rose slowly to his feet, his face a picture of awe and dawning realization. "My God!" he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. He looked from the tablet to Clara. That's Clara Bellwether, Dr. Clara Bellwether, from Brown. I reviewed your dissertation in 2008, Syntactic Anomalies in Pre-Aksumite Inscriptions. It was brilliant. I had no idea. The room erupted in a chaotic buzz of whispers. The truth crashed down on them all. This wasn't a maid. This was a world-class scholar. And Julian Sterling had not just made a fool of himself, he had committed an act of intellectual sacrilege. The hunt was over. The prey had become the hunter. And in the dead silence of his own party, Julian Sterling realized he was the one who had been captured. The revelation of Clara's identity detonated in the room like a bomb. The guests stared, toggling their gazes between the quietly dignified woman in the maid's uniform and the pale, trembling billionaire. The atmosphere of smug amusement had curdled into a thick soup of shock, embarrassment, and a delicious, scandalous tension. Julian Sterling's mind raced, trying to find a way out of the public relations disaster he had just single-handedly created. His first instinct was denial, followed swiftly by rage. He let out a short, forced laugh that sounded more like a bark. Well, well. A little party trick, very clever. You had us all going there for a minute, Clara. You must have looked it up online, rehearsed it. But his words fell flat. No one was buying it. The depth of her analysis, the academic precision, the sheer authenticity of the moment it was impossible to fake. Dr. Finch stepped forward, his expression stern. Don't be a fool, Julian. What she just did is the equivalent of a local pub singer perfectly sight-reading a lost Mozart symphony. It's not something you look up online. I am staking my professional reputation on it. She is who I say she is, and her translation was genuine. Julian's face purpled. He was being contradicted, challenged in his own home. He turned his fury back on Clara. So what? So you used to be some bookworm. That doesn't mean anything. You work for me now. You clean my toilets. And she just won your salary. A voice piped up from the back. It was a young tech investor, known for his disruptive tendencies and a clear enjoyment of the unfolding chaos. He was holding up his phone, the small red light indicating he was recording. A verbal contract witnessed by 24 people. $12 million. I can't wait to see this on Twitter. Panic finally pierced Julian's armor of arrogance. The stakes had suddenly become terrifyingly real. This wasn't just about party room humiliation anymore. This was about money, reputation, and the law. That was a joke. He roared, his voice cracking. A hypothetical A figure of speech. No court in the world would uphold such a ridiculous... I believe they would, Clara said, her voice cutting through his tirade. It was still quiet, yet it carried an immense authority that silenced him. The legal term is unilateral contract, an offer made to the public or a specific person that can be accepted by performing the requested act. Your offer was clear. The conditions were clear. I fulfilled them. The contract is binding. Her calm, legalistic takedown was more devastating than any shout could have been. She had not only bested him linguistically and morally, but she was now schooling him in contract law. Julian Sterling, a man who had built an empire on brutal negotiations and ironclad agreements, was utterly undone. He looked wildly around the room, seeking an ally, but found only averted eyes and fascinated stares. He had made them all complicit in his cruelty, and now none of them would risk associating with his downfall. His gaze fell on his wife. Eleanor was standing now, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a fire he hadn't seen in years. She looked at Clara not with pity, but with a dawning fierce admiration. Then she looked back at her husband with undisguised contempt. Pay her, Julian, Eleanor said, her voice shaking but firm. Pay her what you owe her. That was the final betrayal. To be undermined by his own wife in front of these people was the ultimate blow. Get out, Julian snarled, his voice low and venomous. He wasn't looking at his guests. He was looking at Clara. Get out of my house. You're fired. Clara nodded slowly, a flicker of sadness in her eyes, not for the job, but for the pathetic broken man in front of her. Of course, Mr. Sterling, she said. She turned and walked not towards the service exit she usually used, but straight towards the front door. The guests parted for her, as if she were royalty. As she reached the door, Dr. Alistair Finch intercepted her. Dr. Bellwether, he said, his voice full of respect. Clara, that was the most remarkable thing I have ever witnessed. Please, allow me to give you my card. If you need anything, a reference, legal counsel, anything at all, you must call me. Clara took the card, her fingers closing around the thick, embossed paper. It felt like a key, a ticket back to a world she thought was lost to her forever. Thank you, Dr. Finch. she whispered, her voice thick with emotion for the first time that night. "Thank you." She walked out of the penthouse and into the hallway, leaving behind the wreckage of Julian Sterling's party, and though no one knew it yet, the wreckage of his life. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, the sound of a closing chapter. Inside, the party was dissolving into chaos. The young investor was already furiously typing on his phone. Guests were murmuring, making their excuses, and heading for the door, eager to escape the toxic atmosphere and to be the first to spread the story. Julian stood alone by the fireplace. His fists clenched his billion-dollar empire, suddenly feeling as fragile as a house of cards. He had tried to humiliate a poor maid. Instead, he had handed her a $12 million jackpot and authored his own public execution. The story of the night wasn't over. It was just beginning, and it was about to go viral. The internet is a fire that feeds on hubris, and Julian Sterling had just provided a feast. The spark was the 45-second video posted by Kevin Chen, a young, disruptive tech investor who had long despised Sterling's brand of corporate bullying. Chen hadn't just recorded the clip, he had crafted a narrative. He uploaded it before his car had even reached the ground floor, and by the time he was out on the street, it already had 1,000 views. By the time he got home, it was 100,000. By morning, it was over 50 million. The video was a digital wildfire. It ripped through Twitter, was mirrored on Instagram, dissected on Reddit, and endlessly debated in Facebook groups. The comment section was a coliseum of public opinion. There were memes of Clara as a superhero, the translator, facing off against Julian as a cartoon villain. There were threads dedicated to identifying the script with amateur linguists and historians marveling at her skill. The hashtag #PayClara wasn't just a request. It was a demand, a global rallying cry for fairness. The traditional media, smelling blood in the water, pounced. Tabloids ran screaming headlines. King Julian's $12 million mistake. Respected financial journals took a more somber, but no less damning tone. Ethelred Acquisitions faces crisis of confidence after CEO's public implosion. Think pieces bloomed overnight, analyzing the incident through the lenses of race, class, and corporate ethics. Julian Sterling wasn't just a man who'd made a gaffe. He was now a symbol of arrogant privilege, a case study in how to torch a reputation in a single evening. For Julian, the morning began with the roar of a helicopter. He assumed it was news traffic until he opened his curtains and saw it was a news helicopter, its lens pointed directly at his penthouse window. His phone, which he'd turned off in a rage the night before, showed 172 missed calls. The first one he answered was from Marcus Thorne, the lead director of Ethelred's board. Julian Thorne's voice was ice. "Turn on CNBC." Julian did. He saw his own face, in a grainy still, from the video next to the Ethelred company logo, and a bright red arrow pointing sharply downward. The ticker showed his company's stock in freefall, hemorrhaging value with every passing second. An on-screen chyron read, "Sterling scandal wipes, billions off Ethelred market cap. We're invoking the board's emergency powers," Thorne continued, his voice devoid of any past friendship. "We have a meeting in 2 hours. Your PR team is already drafting a statement." Julian, what in God's name were you thinking? But Julian couldn't process the question. His mind was a maelstrom of denial. It was a joke, Marcus. A party gag. These people are insane. We'll sue them. We'll sue the kid who posted the video for slander. Slander. Julian, it's a direct recording of you making the offer. The only person who looks bad is you. Thorne said, his patience gone. Be at the office, and for God's sake, don't talk to anyone. He hung up. Julian stood in his silent, cavernous living room, the city noise a distant hum. The stone tablet still sat on the mantelpiece, a dark, silent monument to to his own stupidity. Meanwhile, in her quiet apartment in Washington Heights, Clara Bellwether woke up to the sound of a neighbor knocking urgently on her door. It was Mrs. Rodriguez from 3B. Clara, you are on the television," the older woman exclaimed, pointing back towards her own apartment. "Everyone is talking about you." Dazed and confused, Clara followed her into her apartment and saw it. There on the screen was her own face, a still from the party. She was standing tall looking at Julian, her expression calm and resolute. The anchor was recounting the story with breathless excitement. Clara sank into one of Mrs. Rodriguez's chairs, her mind struggling to catch up. The events of the previous night felt like a strange, stressful dream, but this was terrifyingly real. Her cheap phone buzzed. She saw an unknown number with a 212 area code. Hesitantly she answered. "Dr. Bellwether," a voice said, warm and professional. "My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a senior partner at the law firm of Chen, Goldstein and Rivas. We'd like to offer you our services pro bono. We believe you have an undeniable case, and frankly, we would be honored to represent you." She was still stammering a reply when another call came in. It was Dr. Finch. "Clara, the provost at Columbia, wants to have lunch. He's not asking, he's begging. They're prepared to make you an offer that it will be a triumphant return." The calls kept coming. A museum, a publisher, a documentary film crew. Each call was a new brick in the foundation of a life she thought was gone forever. It was overwhelming, a tidal wave of opportunity that left her breathless. Back in the sterile, glass-walled boardroom of Ethelred Acquisitions, Julian was facing his own tidal wave. The board members' men he had once considered his allies looked at him with the cold eyes of executioners. "Your statement is a disaster," Julian, a board member named Henderson, said, tossing a printout onto the table. The press release, which Julian had personally edited against the strenuous advice of his PR team to remove any hint of real apology, was being ridiculed online. His insistence on the phrase obvious hyperbole had become a punchline. "This isn't just about bad press," Marcus Thorne said, leaning forward. "Our largest institutional investor is threatening to pull their pension funds. The European Union's Regulatory Commission has opened an inquiry into our corporate culture, citing your behavior as a potential liability. You haven't just embarrassed us, Julian. You've made us toxic." Julian looked from face to face, searching for a lifeline, but found none. These men weren't his friends. They were custodians of capital, and he had become a bad investment. The final, most devastating blow wasn't delivered in a boardroom, but in the silence of his own home. He returned to the penthouse, late that night, a beaten man. The bravado was gone, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. He expected to find Eleanor to have a fight, to perhaps browbeat her into presenting a united front. Instead, he found an unnerving stillness. Eleanor's closets were open and empty. Her jewelry box sat open on the dresser, its velvet slots bare. On the polished marble of the kitchen island, where he had so arrogantly dismissed Clara, lay a single sheet of heavyweight paper. It was a letter from a law firm, known for its ferociously expensive and successful divorce attorneys. Next to it, catching the last light of the setting sun, was Eleanor's platinum wedding ring. He sank onto a stool, the letter trembling in his hand. He was alone. His wife was gone, his company was abandoning him, and his fortune was evaporating. The entire world, it seemed, was cheering for the quiet, dignified woman he had tried and failed to break. The unraveling was not just professional, it was absolute. The passage of 6 months can feel like a lifetime or no time at all. For Julian Sterling, it was a slow, agonizing descent into a hell of his own making. For Clara Bellwether, It was a rebirth. Julian's story became a textbook example of a modern downfall. The lawsuit filed by Clara's legal team at Chen Goldstein, and Rivas was a masterclass in strategic litigation. They didn't simply go after the $12 million. They filed for wrongful termination, citing his vindictive firing of Clara moments after she fulfilled his challenge. They filed for intentional infliction of emotional distress, detailing the public and cruel nature of the humiliation. And they filed for breach of unilateral contract, laying out the simple, damning facts of his public offer and her public acceptance through performance. The deposition was Julian's Gethsemane. He sat in a sterile conference room, flanked by his beleaguered lawyers, facing the calm, formidable Sarah Chen. Clara was there too, seated next to her counsel. She had insisted on it. She needed to see this through, not for revenge, but for closure. Julian, stripped of his power suits and wearing a rumpled shirt, was a shadow of his former self. He was sullen, argumentative, and repeatedly fell back on the same tired arguments. It was hyperbole, a figure of speech. No reasonable person would have taken it seriously. Dr. Bellwether is a reasonable person. Is she not, Mr. Sterling? Miss Chen asked, her voice dangerously soft. Or is it your position that your employees are by definition unreasonable? Julian flinched as if struck. He looked at Clara, who met his gaze without malice, her expression one of weary resolve. In her eyes, he didn't see the maid he had terrorized. He saw the scholar who had outmaneuvered him, the woman who had become the architect of his ruin. He saw the jury that would crucify him. It was then he knew he would lose. Faced with a trial that would be a media circus and a guaranteed loss, Julian's lawyers pushed him to settle. The final amount was sealed by a confidentiality agreement, but the speed with which Julian had to liquidate assets, including his modern art collection and his Hamptons estate, spoke volumes. The whispers on Wall Street placed the figure north of $15 million, a punitive sum designed to make a very public point. But for Clara, the money was simply raw material for building a better world. Her first act wasn't one of indulgence, but of protection. She convened a meeting in the lobby of her Washington Heights apartment building, a space that had seen decades of worry over rising rents and uncertain futures. She stood before her neighbors, Mrs. Rodriguez the Garcias from 4A, the young family in 2C, and told them that she had purchased the entire building through a newly formed trust. "Your rents will not go up," she announced, her voice echoing in the small, suddenly silent lobby. "No one is going to be priced out. This is our home, and now it's safe." The eruption of joy, of tearful hugs and applause, was more valuable to her than any check. It was the sound of a community given security, a small fortress of stability in a volatile city. Her next project was the Bellwether Foundation. It was launched not with a lavish gala, but with a quiet reception at a Columbia University hall. Dr. Alistair Finch served as the master of ceremonies. The foundation's mission was simple and drawn from the heart of her own past pain, to provide bridge grants for academics in the humanities who faced sudden, life-altering crises, illness, debt, family tragedy that threatened to push them out of their fields. It was a safety net for brilliant minds teetering on the edge. Her memoir, which she titled The Stone's Truth, was released to critical acclaim. It wasn't a tell-all screed against Julian Sterling. He was but a minor character in a much larger story. The book wove together her personal journey with a profound exploration of how ancient languages hold timeless wisdom about justice, humility, and community. An excerpt from its introduction captured the world's attention. We are told that the past is a foreign country, but its words are not behind us. They are beneath us, forming the very foundation upon which we stand. I spent years in a self-imposed exile, believing my voice had been lost. I worked in a penthouse of glass and steel, a place that worshipped the future and disdained the past. But it was there, in that temple of the ephemeral, that a 3,000-year-old truth, etched in stone, reminded me who I was. It taught me that value is not the same as price, and that the quietest voice can sometimes speak the loudest truth. The book became a runaway bestseller, and somewhere in a generic airport bar nursing a whiskey, a diminished Julian Sterling saw it on a newsstand, its cover bearing the serene, confident face of the woman he had once called the Help. He looked away, a ghost, haunted by a past he couldn't escape. Clara's new beginning was fully realized on a crisp autumn afternoon. She stood at the lectern in Columbia's Schermerhorn Hall, the room packed to the rafters. The light streamed through the arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny world. She looked out at the sea of faces, eager students, esteemed colleagues, curious members of the public, and in the front row, a beaming Mrs. Rodriguez. She took a moment, letting the warmth of the room settle over her. She remembered the cold, sterile silence of the Sterling's penthouse, the feeling of being an invisible machine. She remembered the weight of Julian's contempt, and she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her from that gilded cage to this hallowed hall. Language. She began her voice, calm and resonant, filling the space with its quiet authority. Language is the ultimate act of inheritance. It is the vessel that carries the accumulated wisdom of our ancestors across the stormy seas of time. She looked around the room, making eye contact, connecting. We live in an age that worships disruption, that fetishizes the new. We are taught to move fast and break things. But there are some things that should not be broken. Truth, empathy, grace. These are not innovative new concepts. They are ancient load-bearing walls of the entire human project. They are the ideas you find carved in stone because the people who wrote them knew they were truths that must endure. A smile touched her lips, one of deep-earned wisdom. My own story became public because of a challenge over one such stone. But the real challenge was never about translating an ancient script. The challenge for all of us is to translate those ancient values into our modern lives, to recognize that a person's worth is not on their balance sheet, but in their character. To understand that true strength isn't the power to command, but the grace to serve. That is the only kingdom that lasts. That is the only wealth that is real. Clara Bellwether's story is a powerful reminder that dignity, knowledge, and grace are forms of wealth that can never be taken from you. It shows that the world is full of hidden geniuses, in plain sight, in classrooms, in kitchens, in quiet corners, waiting for their moment. The Julian Sterlings of the world may build their empires on arrogance and intimidation, but as we saw, a foundation of sand cannot withstand the simple weight of the truth. What do you think is the most powerful part of Clara's story? The translation itself, or what she did afterward? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you and building this community. If this story moved you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel with notifications turned on. You won't want to miss the next incredible true story we have for you. Thank you for listening.